Good.
All right. Hey, everybody. So I am here with my old friend. Not that we're calling you old. We've known each other a long time.
I'm old.
Ben Rosenbaum.
I'm not calling you old, but I am old. Yes.
Ben Rosenbaum and I were in the Clarion West class of, do we want to admit what year it was?
Yeah.
2001.
Sure.
Back in the
2001.
day. Yeah.
You want to feel old? My Emily held my infant lower than 1 year old daughter during Clarion when she came to visit. She is now in her first year in college.
Yeah. Yeah. Ben was that really annoying guy at Clarion whose first week story got nominated for Nebula. That was Ben. We love Ben. Ben makes us feel bad about ourselves sometimes, but we love Ben. So we're actually the two kind of opposite.
It's all downhill from there.
Yeah, right. We're kind of the two opposite ends of the spectrum though, because Ben already had quite a few short story sales going into Clarion, and there were about 10 of us that had no pro sales. We called ourselves the Nada Crew. And so Ben comes out of Clarion and is the first one to get nominated for a major award. The Nada Crew dwindled over the years. People were getting their pro sales until it was me for like a year and a half. Until finally, when I sold something, that was the end of the Nada Crew.
But then, ironically, you and Susan, who were the last two to leave the Nada Crew, then became, for a while, probably the most commercially successful.
I mean, there's actually been quite a few commercial successes out of
our
class.
True.
Our class also included, so it was me, Susan Yee, made livings full time as writers. Stephanie Burgess,
Linda Demülemeister also had.
Linda Demülemeister, won quite a few awards, and her series has done well. And Evie Zavoy, who most of her books get like reviewed by the New York Times, and she hangs out with a couple. And she's actually
nominated for a National Book Award, or
she's a National Book Award
like
finalist, and sometimes she even still talks to us. But she went back to teach. She's the first one of our class to go back to teach.
And Kiini has had
that's right,
from Aqueduct.
Kiini, who I talked to yesterday, and I don't even remember that. Yeah, Kiini's got she's published a few books, and she won the James Tiptree Award. Her first big press published book is coming out later on this year, called When the World Turned Out.
Now known as the Otherwise Award, where because of essentially it was sort of like there was a new thinking about the end of Tiptree's life, kind of from a disability rights perspective, because there was a certain point of view that people have been like, well, of course it was a murder-suicide because he was, suffering or whatever. And then at some point recently, as part of our general cultural reckoning, a bunch of disabled people were like, maybe he wasn't suffering. Maybe she just thought he was suffering and shot him. Then they were like, maybe we'll change the name of the award, which was a very, hard decision, I think, but.
Like they've changed the name of the Campbell Award and such, like, my friend, Rebecca Roanhorse won the Campbell Award, and around the same time, somebody in our group was doing kind of a retrospective on Campbell's life. And the more we're finding out, the more she's like, "Oh, yay!"
Yeah,
So
I feel like that was a one-person, like Jeanette Ng's speech was like, and that's it for the Campbell Award. She just like one acceptance speech, it's part of a general, really interesting cultural moment.
And so, which goes to show, and this is actually kind of relevant to your career. Our Clarion was at the time a watershed Clarion with how many minorities?
Yeah.
We had 2 Jewish guys, including Ben. We had 3 Asian women. We had 3 Black women. So we were quite the group of.
Yeah, it was. And I think that was very actively, Octavia Butler was teaching that year. And also Nalo. Nalo really very, I think Octavia somewhat more quietly, and Nalo very, very consciously, went after, made a big effort to bring in diversity.
Yeah.
And it was great, right? It was a wild ride. We had some very intense discussions. I learned a lot about Clarion.
I know. Yeah, when you write something that you don't mean to be offensive at all, and one of our Black classmates starts crying, you're like, oh dang.
Yeah. Are you talking about me or you? Or both?
That was actually, I won't say who it was. It was another person who actually had a pretty successful indie publishing career. Who's not, I'm not going to say the name because it's not.
I know what you mean, but I remember there being a racial reckoning around one of my stories. I wrote a story called Nematode Wiggle, and it was very interesting because there was like, the first response was really positive, where Jarla and Evie and Keeney were like, "This story's great. I love what you've done here." And then I like made a side note about my like internal headcanon about it, and they were like, "No, no, you can't."
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh shit." So it was
very, and Keeney, who writes as Kay Aurora,
yeah.
I remember what she said about it. It's like, "Are you telling me a story? Just messing with me right here." But, so, Ben's hallmark has always been, what would you call it? Surrealist writing?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I have these two traditions that were big influences on me when I was a kid, that I have been sort of trying with greater and lesser success to like play in and unite. One of which is, I mean, first I read all the, I grew up kind of on the classics. I mean, on, the Once a Future King and Narnia and, all that stuff. And also the sort of Heinlein and, Pohl and Zelazny, whatever. Well, Zelazny's the later period. But anyway, but the things I really, that was kind of like, just I absorbed everything. Golden Age of science fiction is 12. But the things I think I really imprinted on were, there's that extrapolative science fiction tradition, and the 70s take on it, the like feminist 70s, new wave, Tiptree, Ross, Le Guin, Delaney, Moorcock, Zelazny, like the sort of like mind expanded version of the classic, take on the classic 70s was like a big, like I imprinted on like a duckling. And then the other thing I was reading on around the same time in high school when I was reading Dahlgren and, the Eternal Champion and the Word for World is Forest, or whatever, The Dispossessed, is that I was reading sort of European postmodernists like Kobo Abe and Borges and, South American also postmodernists, but like Kobo Abe and Milan Kundera, and I guess Kobo Abe is Japanese. Why did I say European? Eastern European, Japanese, and Latin American postmodernists. Yeah. And that, so, and there's this interesting thing where what unites them is they're both weird, right? They're both like obviously I was drawn to like, whoa, this blew my mind, right? The sense of novelty and excitement of something strange. But they're also kind of have a different take where one of them proceeds from like, well, there's a material universe and we're going to like ask what if questions about it and then see where that leads us. And the other of which is like, there's the mind experiencing the universe through language, and we're going to start messing with that and messing with your perception as a reader and messing with like what is real. And that's, so that's those two things I think are both really, I've bopped around between them in a way, so and tried to unite them in different ways.
Well, because they have merged in this sort of very Ben Rosenbaum way in your writing.
I feel like a lot of my early stuff is either one or the other. Like a lot of the early short stories were sort of like The Orange is definitely like surreal, metaphysical, and then
so,
what's that?
No, I'm just joking. Yeah, it is incredibly metaphysical and yep.
but then I was writing stuff like Start the Clock and Embracing the New, which were very much, which had some literary flourish, but mostly it's just like, what would happen if, like what if people didn't biologically age? Like what if there's a virus that stopped everyone's biologically aging so that people have been dying for 30 years and playing that game? And then like, the Le Guin and Delaney take of like, well, what would that do anthropologically to people's feelings of self? And what would that, what I mean? But pretty much it's a science fiction story. It's a classic science fiction story. And I was doing other stuff that was like, Sheila exploded and the air was full of gumballs. It was just like sort of surreal.
Yeah, the
and then I feel like some stories began to sort of unite those. I feel like biographical notes on a discourse discourse on the nature of causality with airplanes by Benjamin Rosenbaum. It's you probably shouldn't mention stories with titles that long in interviews. No, anyway, but everyone fast forwarded through that title. I feel like that was like one where I began to be playing both games at once, but it's kind of an interesting.
Well, but it seems like there's also a strong Cory Doctorow-esque vibe through a lot of your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
The guy who works for money and things like that.
Yes.
Playing with alternative economics and.
Right. Yeah, that's also definitely a big interest, and that's sort of economic interest to like, which I think also you can see that coming out of Le Guin too, in a way. Like, it's like, what do we do after capitalism? Like, how could we do this better? That is but also out of that tradition that comes out of cyberpunk, and also Kim Stanley Robinson and Cory Doctorow and Charlie Stross, and and part of that is about the malleability of human being. Like, there's that sort of tradition about, like, we're not gonna just. I feel like to some extent the sort of something that both Cory and I were kind of really interested in, and in between.
Right.
I wrote a story with Cory, a novella at one point, and it's is sort of like there was a sort of a boosterism, extropian, like, we're going to upload our brains and everything will be wonderful,
Right.
kind of reductive vein. And then there in science fiction, or trend, and there was also sort of this, I think, feminist critique of, like, we are fundamentally embodied, we are fundamentally interconnected with the world. We don't want to be like immortal intellect zipping around, not beholden to anyone, eternally able to work our singular will on the universe. Like, that's gross, right? Like, there's, but it's like, but each of these, like, the tradition that was like, we will upload, was sort of missing the deep enmeshed embeddedness of consciousness. And then there was the tradition that was like, we are deeply enmeshed, but it was like often framed in terms of like, and so we'll just stay the way we, why would you and I feel like there's this thing where it's like, we are frighteningly malleable and everything will change. And also that and not just, I mean, there's also a dystopian version of that, which is like, which is sort of like, and that'll be terrible because the robots it'll be the Matrix, the robots will rule everything, which is like, anyway. So yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, but I'm very interested in.
Well, I hope it does, because it kind of does go to the core of a lot of the concepts in your book.
Yeah.
So why don't we kind of do sort of a distillation of the different, there are several short stories that you've done that each take place in a world. So you've done your Droplet, those characters. So what are all the short stories in the Droplet? And you're changing that, and it's interesting how much the world has changed, which is probably kind of an apparent theme of this interview. Just even in the time that we've been in the industry, because you originally had robots called lover boys, or lover girls, and war boys.
Yeah.
And I remember even back at the time that kind of like not registering with me. That, maybe that's something we'll revisit at some point.
Yes, no, I had no idea. Yeah, no, that's true, and that is my this sort of project. So there's a series of stories, including the novel, which are set in kind of like far future. They're like 500,000 years in the future. And one thing I was interested in was it being, so if you don't have faster than light travel is like a very typical tropey cheat, which is fine. If you want to write a story in different galaxies, you want people zipping around, and it's fun, why not have them zip around? But I think one of the interesting things about the science part of science fiction, or the playing by the rules that you've invented, or also looking at the rules of the real world, is it's not that you're going to get it right. I'm obviously not going to be able to predict what things are like in 500,000 years. That is
well,
not
odds
true.
are nobody wants to read it now.
Is,
everybody would think, like it doesn't really relate.
I mean, even if but also that is, but the effort, the sort of rules of the game of trying to keep yourself honest and think like, what would be this like, leads you to much stranger and more interesting places in a way, because your first sort of received ideas tend to be like the same stories we've always told. And one way to get out of the box of telling the same story is to be like, but would that be the case? And so, I wanted to work in this slower than light travel, big, far out stories. Like the idea, we're not just going to zip off and find a place to live on that's like Earth and be like, this is good, we'll just stay the same, I mean, in Star Trek, it's partly a reaction to Star Trek, right? In a way where it's like everybody in Star Trek is zipping around at fast and light speeds, going to other, like across the galaxy, but they still seem to have the social mores. Like if you watch the original series, they're going to the other solar systems. They've got the social mores of the 1960s, and they seem to live about as long as people live. They seem to have the same. It's like the Flintstones version of the Flintstones Jetson thing, where perennially throughout all the eras, like dad goes to work and comes home and complains about his boss, and mom's in the kitchen cooking with a dinosaur dishwasher, like that. That kind of like us taking our social mores and way we see the world and falsely extrapolating that out. I wanted to mess with, I wanted to be like, well, if we will have to change profoundly. Like for us to, maybe we will get to other planets, but it won't be because we found like the super hyperdrive and hopped over there. It'll be by the time you get to resettle on some other planet, you've probably learned to live in space for a while. And like planets are a distant memory, and you're like, oh, a planet, that's interesting. Let's try that. Because, you must have, there, and we have this, I'm also was very interested in how, we kind of have this, a lot of times when we talk about the future, we're just sort of projecting things. Like there's this very colonialist narrative in science fiction. We come and conquer a planet and make it ours, which is like, ugh. Or we get invaded, which is the flip side of that, multi-generational trauma. But that's not how that's akin to the idea that dinosaurs ruled the earth. You know what I mean? Like there's a top dog alpha species that dinosaurs are ruling the earth. Like we're not AIDS is, at the moment Corona is doing fine. At ruling the earth. Like there are ecosystems and they propagate, and what happens is that life expands to fill all niches, right? And so, we're not gonna like launch a rocket and colonize a planet. We're gonna like bleed throughout the solar system and then elsewhere, changing as we go to fill all the niches. And that's much more weird and interesting in a way. So I wanted a big universe where it took, one way you can measure the size of civilization is how long does it take to get across it, right? So now the world is about, the world is like 24 hours wide right now. And a lot of it's a lot of times it seems like in Star Wars or something, it seems to take a day to get from, you know what I mean? I mean, maybe Star Trek actually feels like Star Trek is a thinly veiled 18th century British naval adventure, right? They pull alongside and fire broadsides until they've, hurt the shielding enough to board, So it's Horatio Hornblower. So that's about how big the world feels. So I wanted a world to feel as big, I wanted a galaxy that felt as big as the world did in the Neolithic. Like it would take you thousands of years to get from one end of it to the other, like many generations. Anyway, so there's that series. You were asking about the series of stories. So there's that series of stories.
Yeah.
But one of the things that did was made me have to, like, my idea of how genders work has profoundly changed across the 20 years that I've been writing in that universe. Because there were war boys and lover girls, which I was kind of doing intentionally, well, this is a sort of a almost campy extreme of masculinity and femininity, but I don't actually think those last that long. Like I can no longer bring myself to believe that lasts that long.
And nowadays, lover girl is going to be a real controversial extreme femininity.
Yeah. No, I does not pass that story, and that first story, Droplet, does not pass the Frank Miller test, really. So
there are a lot of things to say about it, but it's
Yeah, and I have officially decanonized, by the way, that version of it. Like there is a version on linked from the website where that's not the canonical version of the story anymore.
And it's been, part of being here for such massive seismic changes and all this coolness going on is meaning we have to keep reevaluating things. In order to talk about things that are relevant today and into the future, and staying relevant means admitting all the way it's like, oh, you're not gonna update that wasn't good.
Yeah. One of the things I think is really in some ways a central text of science fiction is like Ursula K. Le Guin writing, first defending the gender dynamics of the dispossessed, and then 10 years later rewriting an essay critiquing her own essay, demolishing the gender dynamics of not the dispossessed, of the cold one where they go into Kemmer.
The left-handed darkness.
Left-handed darkness, yes. Demolishing the gender dynamics of the left-handed darkness. So anyway, yes, I aspire to be like Le Guin, and
not a bad thing.
They are, by the way, now officially Loverlies and War Children. The people from that. Anyway, so there was that story, and then the other one, just recently, last summer, Bereft, I Come to a Nameless World came out in Asimov. So that's the other one that's set beside the novel.
There's just the two short stories
in that universe.
In that short.
Yeah, well, okay. Technically, there's another one that was on a little journal called Sci-Fi, spelled PHI Journal, which is literally just a snippet of world building. But there are some other unpublished ones that I have not that have been floating around. and maybe I'm missing something, but basically it was those two in the novel.
Okay.
But it has been a long project, although mostly an underground one.
Yeah. I mean, you were doing things like raising children and such as well.
Yeah, and you were, and as you say, I mean, I think you can. There, I sort of wanted to like put on my website like some kind of future history like flowchart where it's like, well, and then this, like these stories could be related this way, which is sort of self-indulgent, but might be amusing. So there's definitely another chain that is falling, and the guy who worked for money. There's a sort of a near future-ish post-capitalist
Right.
Europe
Right.
set. Anyway, I should do
Okay.
more of those. Early in my career, every single story I wrote was in a completely different, like I had to make an entirely new concept and world for each thing. And I don't know, I'm sort of interested in revisiting things a little more. Oh, there's one other chain of projects I should say, which is more game design than world building in some than fiction in some sense. But I published Dream Apart, which is a tabletop role-playing game set in a sort of Jewish, Eastern European Jewish historical fantasy. And I'm writing a sequel to that, which is like an interactive novel for Choice of Games. And that might end up in linear, non-interactive prose at some point as well. But anyway, so.
And you also had, you had your, was it 10 shorts on this different cities?
Yeah, right.
So you've had things like that too.
I think yes. I mean, I guess there's technically, yeah, there's 10 that were published on Strange Horizons. There's one that ended up, and then there was a chapbook, which I think had 12.
Yeah, which I've
because
got.
I think it was those plus two others. Yeah, that's yeah. So those little, which are very much sort of an homage to Calvino's Invisible Cities and also Overnight Debating Distant Cities. Is that Bartholomew? Anyway, but that's very much in that sort of. I mean, some of them are more science fictional, but very much in that playful surrealist, irrealist vein. Yeah.
Yeah. You have.
And then there's a bunch of other things. Oh, wait, there's another series, which is A Siege of Cranes, which is the low fantasy one where it's sort of sword and sorcery-esque one about the little peasant whose village gets eaten by a witch and runs off. That I wrote a sequel to that. Again, it was like 15 years later. That came out in Lightspeed last summer called All You Guardians of Order and Clarity, None of You Can Abide, a Free Witch, which is...
don't do short titles, do you?
Well, the orange. Fig. I wrote a story called Fig. That's 3 letters. But yes, I like long titles. They're cool. Well, again, that's the Delaney. That's a time considered as a helix of semi-precious stones. Trouble on Triton, or some further notes toward the, what is it called? This different something calculus. Anyway,
why people don't do long titles, dude. But
yeah. Well, but I what can I say? You imprint like a duckling. But yes, that story, None of You Can Abide, a Free Witch, is a take on a response to A Siege of Cranes. It's told from the villains. The villain of the first story is the hero of the second story. So.
Gotcha. So, all right, let's talk.
Which I guess, when I think about it, is a move that I'm trying to where did I pick up that pattern? I believe it's
Jarla.
Interview with a Vampire and the Vampire Lestat is actually my like.
Or Jarla. Jarla would always say like.
What were you thinking of?
Remember Jarla in Crits would always say, "Think about it."
Oh.
She always would say.
Yeah. True. So. But I'm just thinking, like, where did I was like somewhere I read something when I was young that was like, this person is the bad guy. Oh no, wait, now we're gonna get a sequel from their perspective.
Right.
I feel like that was Anne Rice. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about your novel, The Unraveling.
Okay.
Did it come out first in German?
It did come out first in German. A version of it came out in German. It's a somewhat different book now in English.
Okay.
So there were
Ben
some years in between.
Right now.
Yes.
Which is where he lives.
Yep. It was written in English, but it came out in German. Because I live here, and also to some extent because the publishing industry here is simpler. Like, there's not much point in getting an agent. Like, it's a pretty straightforward. Authors talk to publishers, the publishers take their book or not. And so I happened to have a connection. I'd happened to have made an acquaintance with a German publisher and submitted it, and they took it, and it was all very simple. And it was a more complicated process, first getting an agent and then getting a publisher for it in English. A fruitful process, because I did there was sort of like several revisions, like I had already revised it many times, and then after it was already published in German, then I was like revising it based on feedback from agents, and then once I got Liz Garinsky at Arrow on, she had tremendously important feedback, which really revolutionized the book in a lot of ways. And it was kind of a joke with my daughter because like for like 7 years, every year successively, I would be like, I've finished the book. And
Yeah.
she just started making fun of me around the third time that I said that and never let up. So,
Have you finished it this time though?
well,
Unless it's going to come out in
it's
another
out.
you're gonna learn.
I mean, I maybe the Hungarian publisher will like insist on a new round of edits. I don't know, but I believe I've finished it.
Well, so going back to, this book is very much about deep time and what that does to humanity over deep time.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really love about it is that your main characters are not human. They are.
They would argue.
Well, but they're not biologically human. They were made.
I mean, they are meant. They are. There's some little Easter eggs in there where it's like they are of paleo-human stock.
Right.
So in a sense, it's sort of like they are. We're already cyborgs, right? We're already getting like laser eye surgery and cochlear implants, and right. so there's this. People use the term post-human. I'll throw around the term post-human a lot in science fiction. It's like, oh, post-human science fiction. It's we are the descendants of what we create that we can imagine. And in some ways, I feel like that is very much from our perspective. Like, why would they consider themselves post-human? Right. You know what I mean? Like, they don't, because they're going to still claim humanity. And in this case, they particularly are quite close to, unlike Siab and Thave and Shar and Nara, who are in Droplet, and Siab and Thave, who are the in Bereft, I Came to the Nameless World, and Thave shows up in the Unraveling. There's some of these like super malleable, polymorphic, they can turn themselves into anything, wacky, far future, post-human folks. But most of the people in this book are really like pretty much human stock. They just have medical technology that makes our, like we're medieval peasants from their point of view. You know what I mean? We're sort of like, our medicine is like bleeding people with leeches and pouring boiling lead, into
right.
a pan near them,
injecting people with diseases to get their immune systems to build up. And
yeah, so their bodies are extremely they part of the idea is they've sort of solved the problems that we have and therefore have new problems. So they live about 800 years on average. They can fix most things, and they can change your body any way you like, in a way, and indeed they can make you more bodies. So it's partly about like what is the limit of what's human, or how different, as you say, deep time, and like how different culturally and technologically things, our context can be.
Well, because I was actually thinking of your characters from Droplet and Thave, and
yeah, they're not human. I mean, they would maybe argue, but
well, what I thought was clever about them is that they're your viewpoint characters in the short stories, and they were made. They're they're kind of robotic by the civilization called the Margin, and there's been a ton. I mean, there's been a ton of robotics, and I mean, there's tons of android type things and whatever. These are the longest lasting because they are so human. They're so adaptive.
Yeah, that's very much true. And they are sort of that lineage of like the Thave and Siab and Chara and Nara, and those people are sort of like, they're kind of like us. Like if you read the Unraveling, they're very minor characters. Like only Thave really shows up on the page, and Siab is referred to. They're sort of part of the deep time backstory of it all. But Unraveling really takes place on a world that was sort of terraformed and settled. And there's a note in the appendix about how basically they came up with some humans they had for like some paleo-human original draft humans that they had for some kind of historical recreation project, and used that as the basis of populating this world. So which is in some ways a little a kind of a playful cheat to make them as human as why do we have these people who are essentially have human bodies? Because partly I wanted to see how different culture can be, even with more or less the bodies that we have. Very often when we think about what's fundamentally human or what's cross-cultural, we kind of look at all human societies we've ever seen so far and are like, well, if it appeared in all those societies, then we can say that's a universal standard. But really, we've only just begun I mean, if you think about it as an expanding niche of cultural evolution, like we're just at the very beginning of what humans could
Well, and
possibly be.
even what's considered like a good survey of human culture is not necessarily a good survey. It tends to be of all the
Right, too.
fantastic colonial powers.
Yes, well, exactly. I mean,
if you look at smaller
yes.
indigenous groups, you realize humans are really diverse. Really,
Right.
diverse.
Tremendously. And because some particular groups like expanded and took everything over, they're massively overrepresented. And so you get these little smidgens of human diversity that are still left if you look. But even that is just like the beginning of, that suggests how different human existence can be. And the thing, it's very much it's very much this tradition of anthropological science fiction that's like Le Guin and Tiptree and Russ and everything, and Delaney, where it's like, all of our cultural verities, all of the things we think of as fundamentally inevitable, are they? And I think partly when you write a novel is an interesting kind of thought experiment because we can't know, but when you write a novel, you're testing it against emotional plausibility. You're like, well, what would it feel like? And if you can how different can you make it and still make it emotionally comprehensible? How much can you still feel for these characters and feel like their struggle is real and like be excited about their lives, while calling into question how we think life has to be.
Right.
Well,
another concept that you explored that was really and I apologize, as you know, we had a family emergency over the weekend, so I was gone and I didn't get a chance to read your galleys.
No worries.
But I've read your short stories and
yeah.
Does this take place in the world that Thave visits at the end?
This is so in Bereft, Siob arrives in the world where the Unraveling is set and sort of meets Thave. And so in that story, there's this freak out scene where Siob comes and is like, oh my God, they have multiple bodies and what's going on? And it's also strange. And sort of, in a way the joke is on Siob, because in fact they're much closer to original humans than Siob was at this point pretty used to living with all the furry spider people on the other planet who have like giant spiderweb cities, and but of course there is also this strange thing going on, which is that they have multiple bodies per person and their consciousness is distributed across one body. I feel like a lot of what I'm doing in this book too is sort of like social satire or reductio ad absurdum of like things in modern life. So there's this sort of pressures of modern capitalism, like you really should be able to be in more than one place at one time. And so there's a sort of a satirical element of like, well, you can be in 5 places at once by having 5 bodies, and then that's like a whole new set of problems. And there's no privacy on this world, or there's privacy is a scarce resource. There's not a lot of scarcity, but privacy is one thing that's extremely scarce. Children are another, because it's a world which is mutual universal surveillance. Like everybody can kind of instantly look up what everyone else on YouTube, which, is kind of like a direction we're heading in, for better and worse. Like a lot of the positive social change has come out of the fact that everyone has a cell phone with a camera and Twitter and whatever. But also there's this specter of like mass surveillance everywhere, which, Corey also writes about a lot. And, so this is kind of an extreme, somewhat utopian, like in a way it's I like to do a thing, this is also true in The Guy Who Worked for Money, where I try to think of the most utopian society I can convince myself of, and then see how it's a dystopia. You know what I mean? And then then ask who suffers. Also something I think we learned, they told us at Clarion.
I think Bereft is a good way to kind of get into your world, because it's one of these margin created robots having a crisis. They've been through so many civilizations and they just watch the collapse of another civilization. And they come to the world where the Unraveling takes place, and they kind of have to just reckon with pull themselves together again, and understand that it's with humanity, it's never over, it's just always different. It's just always
different. And in a way, it's interesting that the story of the composition of that is interesting. So originally the story that you're reading with Bereft is kind of like, that is sort of like the final chapter of this very big journey of Siob's, which is sort of, Siob is kind of this like wandering, it was only some years after I'd first written it that I was like, oh, he's the wandering Jew. Also, he's Doctor Who. Or not no longer a he. At some point in history, but I should say, because I think that Siab, upon arriving in the world of the Unraveling, would be gendered veil, so that would be the V pronoun. But I originally wrote the book about Siab, and and um, and I threw away 40,000 words of the first draft of what became the Unraveling,
Right.
because what had happened is I was like, well, it was going to be like Bereft, that like Siab would arrive and it would be this, type sort of struggle on this grand level of like what happens in history, and these are sort of these agents who are, Siab and Save have this sort of massive influence of scope, like this ability to change the destiny of worlds, and like
Right.
they arrive and then there's this whole plot, right?
Right.
And I was like, well, nobody's going to care about this high level plot unless we have who lives on this world. Like, it's fine to just briefly sketch the world that Siab left, but like when Siab gets to the Unraveling, who lives here? Why do we care? And so I was like, well, we have to do the Midsummer Night's Dream thing where you have Oberon and Titania level, but then you have like Bottom, and you know what I mean? Then you have, Lysander level, and then you have, there's a different, we show what's going on. So I was like, what does an average middle class family on this planet look like, and how weird can I make that? How weird? I'm just gonna have a side character that's like just a fretting adolescent who's like bothered by their parents paying too much attention to them, and just like ordinary like homework trouble, first love, like just like that. Like that'll be like a little local color, human interest. It'll ground us in why this planet matters. And so I was like, all right, that's the B plot. The A plot is Siob's grand machinations and Thaves and like their conflict of the fate of the world or whatever, and the B plot will be this kid who maybe gets swept up in the events that are caused by the A plot. And the more I wrote that, the more the A plot bogged down. Like Siab ended up buried in the tundra, having like 10,000 word long flashbacks about how Siab had screwed everything up and everywhere Siab had gone and how depressed Siab was, and he could not get Siab out of the tundra. And Fift, meanwhile, the ordinary kid, was having all these adventures and meeting all these, and like I was like, Fift is way more fun to write. And so A, Fift was way more fun to write. B, Siab got depressed, and Siab and I had a labor dispute, and so I ended up firing Siab. And C, I think this was pointing me toward a really interesting thing I needed to grapple with about what I believe about historical agency, because the tropes that we've been handed by science fiction are like small group of people with prodigious important powers save the world. Like they get the MacGuffin and they invent the MacGuffin, and it's the thing that will change everything, and they're there in the right place in the right time, or they're chosen, or they're destined, or they're like just, and so they manage to like they're the ones who have to decide. We have to have like 2 to 7 characters. We can't have more than that, who are the ones who will decide the fate of the world. And I'm like, the more I wrote that, I was like, I don't that does not reflect my experience.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if I was, I don't know, maybe if I was had I don't know, maybe if I was Chelsea Clinton or Sasha Obama or somebody, maybe, you know what I mean? Maybe if I'd like grown up in the halls of power, maybe I'd be like, oh, the few people, but I don't know those people. Like what I know is our moral agency is like, there's so many people doing so many things in such a complicated way. And it's not that your moral agency doesn't matter. It does matter. You are in a historical moment. You have to step up, but you have limited information. You're never sure you're doing the right thing. You're going to do the best you can. Maybe you'll have a moment when you're handed the microphone. Maybe you'll have your weird viral 15 minutes of fame where like you could make a difference if you did the right thing, and then it's gone and you'll never know how much effect it had, or if it was even, that's the world I want to write about. Right. So it turned out I didn't need the A plot. So the entire book is
just look at it from the writing point of view. I mean, the writers that we remember 200, 300 years later and still read and enjoy are not necessarily the people who were selling tons of books back then. And you never know. You do your best, but you never know whether you captured something that's going to stay with humanity for a couple hundred years and still be relatable.
Yeah.
As opposed to something that is so local to your time that people, 100 years later are like, who are these people? Like, I don't know.
Yeah. True. It's you don't know. Yeah. And that kind of, it's the same on a creative level. You can, and I wanted to write that. I wanted to write, you can do in that you live in a vastly confusing world, both on the global level and on the level of your individual life, particularly if you're a teenager, and but also if you're in your 40s, where the book has ends up sort of showing a glimpse of later, hopefully that's not a spoiler. But you know, your moral agency is not that of. I found out that I profoundly did not want to write at novel length about, like, and maybe I will at some point, but like about the crew who are exempt, who are the excellent special people who find the MacGuffin and can change everything. Like, I was like, I don't know those people.
Right.
I've never met those people. Like, I want to write about people who like are in the middle of a mess and like do the best they can.
Right.
And like maybe it makes a difference. Like, that's what I want to write about.
And one thing I thought was, so one of the part of your backstory, or these people who were made during the margin, or by the margin, have a lot of experience with human civilizations and have some broad rules about what works and doesn't work. And one of those I thought was really interesting was decoupled civilizations are a nightmare. So you want to talk a little bit about, like, first of all, what decoupling is and why you consider it a very fragile.
Yes. Well, again, that's and I love that you asked that. Again, something that, like, blink and you'll miss it in the novel, because it's sort of like something that there's a moment in a conversation with Thave where if you know the short stories, you can tell that that's what Thave is thinking about. But it's a much bigger deal in the short stories, and I think it's partly there was a point where David Moles and Ted Chiang and I were banned from talking about the Singularity in Karen Meisner's house. Like, there would always be a party after WisCon, and Karen Meisner, she was like, no one can, no more talking about the Singularity. Because there was a moment.
So for the people who aren't all steeped in science fiction culture, what is a singularity, and like.
Yeah, and science fiction culture of 10 to 15 years ago, because I feel like that moment has passed. And it's not, but there was a period there around 2006 or something where everyone was quite interested. So Werner Vinge originally wrote this paper, paper in the 80s, talking about the original singularity. The Vingian singularity was like, we'll make a computer. It was like a mathematical proof by induction. If you assume that we are smart, if we are smart enough to make a computer that is smarter than us, then it will be smart enough to make a computer that is smarter than it. This is like a medieval proof of the existence of God. Right. Naturally, it must be the case, since smartness is a virtue that is very much like Anselm's proof of the existence of God. Right. Like, because smartness is a thing which, is a virtue, and if we make someone more virtuous, i.e. smart than us, there must be something more virtuous than them. And in the Vingian version, this means that very quickly you get to something that's like, n it's something that's n smart can make something that's n plus 1 smart, and so you quickly get to this thing that's like unimaginably smart to whom we are as ants.
Right.
This is both a really interesting idea, and I feel like captures some truth about the malleability of consciousness, of what consciousness is, and also I think it's a completely broken idea. Like, it's a broken idea on a lot of levels, because and it partly has to do with this great chain of being idea that, like, there's just better. Smartness is just better. It's like an idea that it's unidimensional, and it's like the way that we make things is by being smart, which, let me tell you, as someone who's worked as a computer programmer for the last 20, 30 years and seen the growth of the IT industry, one of the things that's really interesting that's happened in IT is that this, both in AI and in just regular production of programs, is that this Apollonian notion that our intellect will design the things has been humbled again and again and again. And it's really interesting, as a side note, that I feel like we in the 60s, we imagined a butch future, and what we got is a femme future. Like, we imagine, when people in the 60s wrote about now, they were like, we will go really fast. We will have these giant metal machines, and we'll go to other stars, and we'll build things, and we'll have, you know what I mean? Like, we'll zoom. Turned out they were just a few like the Concorde is the fastest thing that is on Earth, right? Like, the 1970s, we had supersonic planes. We don't anymore. Like, that whole, like, what a few people then saw, but was not, like, what we actually have is little devices. We can whisper, everybody can whisper about, can listen in to everyone else and connect to everyone else. We have, like, constant. And the other thing is that the way they made software then was like, the grand architect makes the plan, and then the slightly less smart people implement the plan, and then there are people who test it, and then it is rolled out, and then it works because the grand art, and it, which is a disaster for software development, right?
I mean, the being 7 billion monkeys with 7 billion typewriters is actually the way we do a lot of our
Yeah, and in particular, like I got very into in my day job, I got very into agile development, which is a lot like science, in that it's like assume we're wrong. We have no idea what we're doing. We do something and then find out that that was wrong, and then do the next thing. So the reason, and things are incommensurate at different scales. Like just because you were smart enough to make a smart thing, smarter than you, whatever the hell that means, you just
Right.
made a different thing.
Right.
You just made a different thing that exists in a different niche, and it can do other stuff, which may or may not have anything to do with what you want to do. There's a lot of projection in the idea of the singularity. It becomes like us, except like gods.
Right. So the
Anyway,
singularity, like in a nutshell, is when computers become human, or humans can upload their brains. There's like different versions of it, but it's usually
yes, yeah,
human consciousness being decoupled from
yes,
temporality.
yes. And so the idea in this series about how they're sort of terrified of cultures becoming decoupled is that the idea being, and it comes out of two things. One is my unease with the um, Platonic dualism of the singularity. Like, we're just a brain. This body stuff is, ooh, it's icky, and
Right.
and we just want to be a pure mathematical brain running around, which is like
Right.
seems like a bit of self-hate inculcated by patriarchy. So there's that, and then also there's also a cheat where it's like I wanted to have, whenever you're writing about very far future stuff, and sort of like post-human, or like you want to explore how malleable things are, you have to have some cheats to make it comprehensible. Like, it's quite easily imaginable that, like, 500 million years in the future, why can we even understand anything that's going on in this
Right.
story, right?
Right.
And so one of the things that I both believed in and found fictionally convenient was to be like, if you can upload your brain, you can make like uh, a society like in Greg Egan's Diaspora that's a completely, like, you're just an expression of pure math running on a server. But once you do that, you have no friction. Like, you can have anything you want, and because you can have anything you want, you can have more of anything you want. You can change yourself. And so a society like that, they may have like a delightfully, wonderfully long time, but viewed from the outside, it took like 20 minutes, and then the server's dead because they've all turned themselves into penguin icons. You know what I mean? Like, one bad meme.
Right.
And so
And it's also more
uh,
breakable.
yeah, it's super fragile because they're decoupled from the world. They're just this fluid, malleable, like they're gonna, like, cultures change dramatically anyway, and they're just gonna spiral into some end state. Like, there's nothing homeostatic about being an uploaded bunch of bits. Anyway, that's what, I'm not sure that's really true, but it's certainly what Siab and Thave believe. It's what they're worried about because they've seen time and again. And I think it's also about the idea that individual power and longevity and durability is not commensurate with social sustainability and durability, right? Like, in a way, Siab and Thave are tragic figures because they're orphan tech. They're produced by this culture that had these grand ambitions and made these people who can last forever, but it fell because that's not, like, having people who live forever is not actually a good way to make your civilization live forever. Like, there's no reason it should be, right? And
Right.
and so uh, and so, in fact, the world of the Unraveling, which is full of humans with a few tweaks, there are no men and women. They have a whole different idea of gender,
Well, but
and
they
they
do have
have,
on the surface, they've got the backup, which are paleo humans running around chasing lupines.
no, that's who I mean. I'm talking about the paleo-humans. The
Oh, the paleo
paleo-humans
humans?
are
Okay.
literally, physically, biologically, pretty much like us,
Okay.
except with amazing medical technology. So if they want to have a purple tail, they can. You know what I mean? Like, they can alter their bodies.
Right.
But, like, pretty much on a genetic level, they're like us. But they don't have any men and women because those are social constructs that of our culture. Like, that's not a thing. Like, technically, if you ask whether, like, they know that there's a bimodal distribution of, like, hormones, so they know that there's sort of like what we would think of as male or female
Mhm.
physiology, like averagely, statistically male or female physiology. They would acknowledge that exists, but that's kind of like a detail you would find in a medical textbook. It's like some people, it's like knowing about the pancreas. You know what I mean? It's like we invest these minor biological differences. Like, so there's actually like a blurred spectrum of all kinds of ways that human physiology can work. But there are these two big lumps that are kind of like what we think of. When a baby comes out, we look at it and we assign it a gender based
Right.
on its
Can this
equipment,
gestate or not gestate another human?
which we actually don't know by looking at the equipment. What we do is we look and see if it has a penis and vagina. Of course, if it's androgen insensitive, it'll have a vagina but testes, but we don't know that because we're not going to, you don't do a CAT scan. So we just look at the rough physiology it has, and we make, and then we slot it into one of these two categories, and then we we erect upon that this enormous cultural edifice of like what it should do, how much it should talk, whether it should, whether when it decides to have sex, that's taking or giving. Like we're, you know what I mean? Like we completely look at everything through the lens. There's nothing. What? Like and often, by the way, in a way that is nonsensical. Like in our culture, an erect, I mean, I hope this isn't too explicit for this podcast, but an erect penis is like this dangerous sword, which is absurd. Erect penises are highly fragile. Like there's like you are in a very vulnerable position. Like one bad twist and you have anyway. So we have these weird ideas that and then we put kids into these, we stick kids in these culture where everything about them has been determined. It's like horoscopes. It's like if we were like, you're a Leo, you have to be, you know what I mean? We sort of think of that true of horoscopes, but not the way we do about gender. Like gender, we think you really should be the hard kind of person or the soft kind of person, which is absurd. Like looking at it. So what I wanted to do was construct a society that's full of biological humans, and they do the same thing. When a baby comes out, they look at it and they make a decision, but it's not based on genitals, because genitals are very easy to change in this society. I mean, people's connection with their genitals is a very important part of human embodiment. And there certainly are people who, like, there's a bit in the novel where Shreya, who's a genital designer, is like, genitals are not hats. You can't just give anybody any genitals. They'll be really sad, which is I thought was important to have in there, because I think that it's not like dysphoria goes away in this society. It's not like it's not like that's purely cultural, right? I wanted to make sure that I wasn't saying that that gender dysphoria was purely cultural. However, they don't have the same words that we do for things, and they have totally different conception of gender. So what they do when the baby comes out is they have midwives, who are this very important caste, who do essentially an APGAR test. They decide how active the baby is. And if it's a very active baby in the first moments, then they decide that it's a veil, which is the Kirk gender. It's the emotive, expressive, violent. They're the ones who get to fight and cry and have lots of sex and be fast, and then or if it's a calmer baby, they decide that it's a state. And the states are ones that are like very restrained and logical and peaceful and passive and quiet and analytical. The Spock gender, right? There's like the Kirk gender and the Spock gender. So kind of introverts and extroverts. I don't know, like they're just these two genders, and they have this whole idea. And I wanted to create that feeling that this arbitrary assignment has been made, and then it's embarrassing to be a veil and act in a statish way, or to be a state and act in a veilish way. It seems, or maybe it's racy and exciting if you do it just right. All the complexity of the way there should be the equivalent of being a tomboy, which is sort of like, oh, it's a little spicy that you're acting a little gender nonconforming, but make sure you don't go too far, or anyway, all that stuff that we do, I wanted them to do, except like, I really don't want, and Liz Gorinsky, my editor, was the one who finally made me brave enough, after many years of my swapping back and forth, who are the he's and who are the she's, because I was just going to use, I was like, it's too hard to use other pronouns. People won't read a book like that. I should just assign he or she. But of course, that was kind of a problem, because you can't not read the she's as female and the he's as male. Like it's hard to get your brain not to do that. Liz finally convinced me to just use neopronouns. So now the stades are Z and the veils are V. And it works much better, because I really want to break I really want to put you in the situation of being alienated from gender and see it as, and see the absurdity of what they're doing and realize it's the same absurdity that we are doing.
Right.
Anyway.
So yeah. As everybody can see, Ben doesn't really think a lot about his writing. He's very much the first draft, spell check, send it out kind of guy.
Yeah, exactly. One manual typewriter in each hand. Typing 2 stories at once.
Yeah.
Never Heinleinia, never revise. Get my 3 cents a word. That's the 1930s pulp ethic.
Well, one of the privileges of knowing you is having anecdotes about you, and there's one anecdote I want to share before we close, and that is, we were at Clarion West, and Ari wrote this beautiful story called Bird of Paradise. Gorgeous story about a Jewish girl during the Second World War, who was sent into a boarding school in Argentina. And basically, it's a story about loss and being so far from the people you've lost, not even really fully understanding what all has been lost, being sent somewhere to be protected, but meaning you're also disconnected. And one of the metaphors that he uses is a lot of birds, a lot of dead birds that she doesn't see as dead, gathering them up and bringing them in. And, so it's this heart-rending story about a girl understanding the Holocaust from a very distanced, alienated, unable to reach the people that she loves point of view. And then the first thing he says in his critique is, I would like to out myself as a former party clown.
I do remember the quote because it was on the t-shirt. I didn't remember it was about that story, and I have no idea how it's connected.
He's like, I want to out myself as a former party clown. We're like, and it was about whether or not you could pack a lot of birds together in small spaces.
Yes, I do have some experience packing birds into small spaces as a former party clown.
Spaces, but
yeah, that's a weird bit of professional knowledge that I retained. That makes sense now, but it is a pretty funny way to start the.
Because Ben's one of the other Jewish guys. Ben, you've got your own connection to the story. Your family's been through an iteration of that themselves, and what you say is, I'd like to out myself as a former party clown.
Yeah, well, it might be a certain. I possibly didn't. It's kind of funny because possibly as a Jewish guy, I was like, oh yeah, story about the Holocaust. That's everyone else is waiting to see what the other Jewish guy will say. Yeah. I'm like, oh well. By the way, I don't think you can pack that many birds into it. Yeah. Yes, very matter-of-fact relationship with the material. Yes.
So I'm gonna.
Sometimes they kill us, and also you can't pack that many birds into a small space. Anyway, yes.
You can actually pack this many birds, but you can't.
Or you can. They go to sleep. They go right to sleep.
And then you start telling stories about being a party clown and packing birds in the car and running into the party and being like, I have to do this trick now. Yeah. Which kind of
right. I have to do this trick now.
Feel of the moment when you were talking about
now that. I feel bad. I feel like I ruined Ari's critique. Well, I hope I've learned in the intervening years.
Special moment.
Not upstage the person's story under critique.
But so I'm going to include all the links to a lot of the short stories that we talk about and to Ben's novel with this video. And so I would actually recommend, and I'll if and I'll actually put this in the blurb around the video. If you've kind of gotten to the end of this video and kind of been like, what are these people talking about? Read at least one of his short stories, and then I think a lot of it will pop into stark relief. How Ben's brain works, which is a very alien place, but a very cool place to visit. Thank you so much.
Excellent.
I'm gonna
thank you.
end the recording here.